every single way to create and declare a function with JavaScript starting now. On the left, I have Visual Studio Code open. I have a basic HTML boilerplate with some basic styling and some headings with a div where I'm going to be displaying the outputs of the functions that we're going to be creating here. Also linked to my JavaScript file using the script HTML element. Now I'm going to navigate to my scripts.js file, and you're going to notice that I already created a constant variable called output where I am getting my functions outputs ID from my HTML page. All I'm doing here is grabbing this so we can use it to display information over here on the right side of our page. Now I want to show you guys the first way you guys can create a function in JavaScript using a function declaration. Typing function and then the name that you want to call this particular function. And in our case, we're going to call this basic. And then of course you do need those parentheses, and then we are going to need our curly braces as well. And all I want to do is show you guys how this works. So I'm going to use my output variable that I created up here. And what I want to do here is change the inner HTML value to a string. This is the most basic way to declare a function. If you're a beginner, definitely start creating your functions this way. Now all I want to do is call my JavaScript function here, which means I'm actually going to activate it with this call here. And now we're going to go ahead and save and refresh. And you guys are going to see that this is the most basic way to declare a function. It's displaying on my live server because I successfully created this function using my function declaration, and I successfully called my function down below here. If I move my function call above my function declaration and go ahead and save, you're going to notice that it still works perfectly fine. And if we inspect and go to our console, we don't have any errors. Again, our function here is hoisted all the way to the top using our function declaration. Now we're going to move on to number 2, the function expression. A function expression is going to be created using a variable declaration like const, let, or var. In this case, we're going to be using const. And we're simply going to call this funcexp for function expression here. And we're going to make this equal to our function keyword. And we're going to add our parentheses where you can, of course, add parameters if you want. But for today's video, we're not going to do so. Now you want to add your curly brackets here. And then all we want to do is once again change our output.inner HTML value to a new string. And this string is simply going to read, this is a function expression. Now we're going to go down below here and again call our function, which is going to activate it. And you will see on our live server over here, this is a function expression, will print out onto our page, and there are no errors in our console here. But what I want to point out is with function expressions, they are not hoisted to the top of your code. And you're going to see that right here, that if I call my function before I declare it using my expression, it's not going to print anything, and we are going to have an error listed in our console that says cannot access our function here before initialization, because again, we cannot call this function before we declare it when it comes to function expressions. Number 3 is going to be our arrow function that was introduced in ES6 back in 2015 now. To create this function, we're again going to start with a constant keyword here, but you can use let or var. And we're simply going to name our function arrow here. Then we're going to put an equal sign, our parentheses, where again, you can put your parameters if you need to. Then we're going to create what looks like an arrow. That's where the name of this function comes from, using our equal sign and our greater than sign, and then our curly brackets here. And we're simply going to change our inner HTML value one more time to a new string. And our string is going to read, this is an arrow function, and we are going to once again call our function down below right here, and you guys will see in our live server that this is an arrow function, does successfully print out without any errors in our console, letting us know that we did this correctly. Now again, this is not hoisted, so if we put this above our function call here and save, it's not going to print out, and you are going to see that same error, cannot access arrow before initialization. Number 4 is going to be our arrow function without a block. This is going to be super useful for those really short and to the point functions that you can fit all on one line to keep your code looking a lot cleaner. This function is going to start with a variable keyword like var, let, or const. In our case, we're going to be using a const keyword, and we're going to call our function arrow no block and make that equal to our empty parentheses. Again, here is where you can put your parameters if you need to add them, and then we are simply going to create our arrow one more time with our equal sign and greater than sign, and this time we're not going to have any curly braces, and we're going to change our output here .inner HTML so we can once again print this out on the right side in our live server to a string. And our string is going to say this is an arrow function without our curly braces. And now we want to go ahead and call our function down below using arrow no block and including our parentheses here, and go ahead and save that. Put your semicolon in the right place, then go ahead and save it, and you will see that this is an arrow function without our curly braces, is printing out on our live server without any errors in the console, letting us know that we created this function correctly. And again, our arrow function without the block is not going to be hoisted to the top of our code, meaning we cannot call it before we create our function. So now you guys will see nothing displays and our error message of cannot access arrow no block before initialization is present in our console. Number 5, we're gonna move on to the generator function. This is going to allow for pausing and resuming functions, and they are not hoisted to the top of your code. This function is going to be declared using our function keyword and also the asterisk right at the end of our function keyword, just like so. Then after that, we are going to name our function generation, include our parentheses, and again, here is where you can add your parameters, then add our curly braces. Then we're again going to use our output variable, and we're going to change the inner HTML to a string that contains first generation, a dash, and an HTML break element like so. Then what we're gonna do is go down below this, and we're actually going to type yield, and this is going to be where our pausing is going to happen once we start using our function. And that's the major difference when you use this generator function, is that you can pause and resume the function as you please using the yield keyword. So one more time, we're gonna reference our output variable and the inner HTML again. And what we're gonna do is say second generation down below here. So we can see the second generation, get rid of this dash and the break at the end. And lastly, we also wanna add our plus operator here so we do not overwrite our inner HTML that we used up here. This is going to add second generation to the end of first generation. Now what we want to do is we want to create what's called an iterator, because we need to iterate through this generator function. So we're going to create a constant called gen, and we're going to make this equal to our generation function. And now what we want to do is actually call our function and use our iterator. So what we're going to do is reference our iterator, which contains our generation function, and then we're going to use dot and our keyword next. And what this is going to do is it's going to run the first line in our generation function here, and then it's going to pause wherever it sees this yield keyword. So we'll save and refresh, and now you guys can see it's printing first generation with our dash, but but it is not printing our second line of code within our function here because our function is currently paused where it says yield. If we want to use this second line of code in our generation function, what we can do is reference gen again and then type next again, just like so. And what this is going to do is it's going to say we want to resume our code and use our next line here. And now you guys can see that it says first generation and second generation. And keep in mind, you can use yield multiple times in a generator function, but this is just a basic example to show you guys how this works. Generator functions are not hoisted to the top of your code, meaning you cannot call them before you declare them. So if I put my function calls above where I create the function, you're going to notice that it doesn't work, and our console has a cannot access gen before initialization error. That means we're trying to call it before we actually declared it. Number 6, we're gonna move to our immediately invoked function expression. This function is going to be called as soon as your code is read, meaning that you do not have to use the function name to call it. And I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys what that looks like now. What you wanna do, it's gonna seem counterintuitive, is start with parentheses. And here you wanna type function and then your parentheses again, and these parentheses are where you can put any parameters that you want to add. Then you want to go ahead and add your curly braces. We're going to reference our output variable again so we can print this out to our page, and then change the inner HTML value. And then we're gonna add a string that says this function is immediately executed. And then at the end, we want to add our parentheses, and this is basically going to be our function call. So if you are, for example, using a parameter such as x, here is where you're going to want to insert your parameter like so. But in our case, we are not going to be using any parameters, so we're gonna leave this little parenthesis block here blank. Now you're gonna notice that I am not calling this function anywhere below it, and you're gonna see that our function is immediately executed without a formal function call. Technically, this parenthesis is sort of acting as a function call, so it depends on how you look at this one. And this is a really cool way to declare a function where it immediately invokes, but the bad part about this is if I want to reuse it again, I have to repeat my code. That's the whole purpose of creating a function in the first place, is so you don't repeat yourself. So if you guys do want to call this function more than once, what you can do here is basically turn it into a function expression using your const let or var keyword, and then we're going to call this trial for the sake of the video, and then we're going to make that equal to our immediately invoked function. And now we can run trial as many times as we like down below here, and it will work perfectly fine. So this will be useful if you do need to insert parameters into your immediately invoked function expression here. But again, I would recommend just doing it the normal way because that's how most programmers and most people are used to seeing it. This may throw some people off, especially if they're not familiar with this specific function declaration. When you use this type of function declaration, it is not going to be hoisted, meaning that if you try and call your function before you declare it, it is not going to work. As you guys can see over here, it is not printing, and our error message cannot access trial before initialization is printing in our console. Number 7 is going to be the named function expression. This function is going to start off with the var, let, or const variable keywords. In our case, we're going to use const, and we're going to name our variable named exp for named expression. Going to make that equal to our function declaration here, and then we're going to call our function named like so, then add our parentheses just like normal. And as you guys can see, this looks extremely similar to just a basic function declaration. All we're doing is adding a variable in front of it, and making it equal to our function. Now what we want to do is reference our output variable here and change the inner HTML of this particular element to a string that says this is a named function expression. Now what we want to do is actually go ahead and call our function. You guys might be confused as to how to call this function, but to call it, we're going to use our variable called named exp, just like so, with our parentheses again at the end. You can reference this function here that's called named, but you can only reference it within our function block here. Now if we go ahead and save that, this is a named function, successfully prints out on our HTML page, and we have no errors in our console letting us know that we created this correctly. For our named function expression, we're not going to be able to call it before we declare it. This means that it is not going to be hoisted to the top. So now if we go ahead and try this, it is not going to print out successfully, and we're gonna have the error message that says cannot access named exp before initialization in our console, letting us know that we're having that exact error. Number 8 is going to be declaring a function with default parameters. You can use this on any of the types that we already discussed, but for this case, we're going to use our basic function declaration here using our function keyword. Then we're going to call our function default func, just like so. Then we're going to add our parentheses, and then we are going to include a parameter here called name, and then we're going to make this equal to a string that says this is a default parameter. Now we're going to reference our output variable that we declared above our function, and we want to change our inner HTML value to our name parameter here. Now what we want to do is call our default func function here using our parameters, and if we do not specify anything to pass into our name parameter, what's going to happen is it's going to use our default value here, that this is a default parameter, and display it on our page here. This is a default parameter. But let's say we do pass in something into this function call here. It's going to go into our function and display as that parameter. So now you guys can see I am passing in 1 for the name parameter here, and it is displaying 1 on this side of our page. Number 9 is going to be declaring a function using a function constructor. Now what you want to do is start by using a variable keyword such as var, let, or const. In our case, we're going to use const. We're going to call this func construct, just like so, for our function constructor, and make that equal to our keyword new, and then we're going to specify function with a capital F here. Then we're going to use our parentheses, and then if you do want to pass a parameter here, what you need to do is include it in double or single quotes, just like so. And in our case, we actually need to pass in a parameter to this function constructor here. Now to actually use this function constructor, what you want to do is call it using our func construct in our parentheses, and then we're going to pass in our output variable here, and we want to change the inner HTML value to a string that says this is a named function constructor. And now if we go ahead and refresh our page, you're going to notice that this is a named function constructor is going to successfully display on our page. Using a function constructor is never a good idea because it does pose a security risk, and there are a lot of potential issues to using a function constructor, so it's pretty much never recommended, only in extremely rare cases. Number 10, we're going to move on to our asynchronous function. This is a super advanced way to use and create a function. Let's go ahead and get into it. First, what we want to do is create a normal function using our function declaration here. And what we're going to call this is simulate async operation. And this is not going to be our asynchronous function yet, but it is going to be essential to using our asynchronous function. And now what we want to do is return a new promise here, because asynchronous functions in JavaScript are going to be promise based. Now what we want to do is specify resolve here, use our arrow function syntax followed by our curly braces, and then what we want to do is use our set timeout method here to actually delay this, because what we're doing here is we're simulating an asynchronous function here, but we're not actually pulling information from a API, for example. Normally that's what you would use an asynchronous function for in JavaScript. Now we want to add our parentheses followed by another set of parentheses, and then we want to use our arrow function syntax again followed by our brackets, and then we want to use our resolve method here followed by our parentheses again. And what we want to do in this specific case is actually delay our function by 4,000 milliseconds or 4 seconds. And what we need to do here is actually move this inside of our last parenthesis here, add a comma just before that, followed by our semicolon here. And then for our sake, we do need to remove ms here for milliseconds, but know that this is equivalent to 4 seconds. Now what we want to do is actually declare our async function. And the way to declare a asynchronous function is by simply typing async at the beginning of our function declaration. And now we're simply going to call this display string followed by our parentheses, just like a normal function declaration, then followed by our curly brackets. Now what we want to do here is console.log out a string that contains asynchronous operation started, so we can actually see this live in action once we finish this function. Now what we want to do is simulate our asynchronous operation using the await keyword by simply typing await. Then we want to call our simulate async operation function that we created up here just before this function that we are creating now. Then what we want to do is console.log async operation completed, displaying result. Again, this is going to make a lot more sense once we actually see this at work in our console. Now what we want to do is create a new constant variable called example, and we're going to make this equal to our output variable to display this on our page using inner HTML equals asynchronous function. And what we want to do is actually return our example variable that we just created. Now what we need to do is actually call our async function here, and to do that we're simply going to use a normal function call just like so. But now where it gets different is we're going to want to use .then, because again this is promise based, the asynchronous function is. And then what we want to do is type out our result, our arrow function syntax, followed by our brackets, and then we want to display our result from this particular function. Now we're going to go ahead and hit save, and what I want to do here is I want to open my console here using inspect, going to console. So let's go ahead and try this out, and you're going to see async operation starting and our output's not there, but after 4 seconds our output does successfully appear as asynchronous function here, and then async operation completed, displaying result is successfully printed out to our console. Let me go ahead and refresh so you guys can see that one more time in action. It looks pretty cool and it is working great. So again, asynchronous functions are really useful if you're requesting something for a server or you're grabbing information from an API or something along those lines. And then the great thing about the asynchronous function is it is going to let the rest of the code continue to run while you're making that server request or requesting an object from an API or something along those lines. So that's really the major benefit behind using a asynchronous function like this, is that it lets the rest of the code on your page run while you're waiting for the rest of this code to successfully execute. If you have any questions, reach out to us today through this video in the comments below, or go to our website at kalmanwebdesign.com, and we would love to help you out and explain even further. Thanks so much for watching. I hope it helped out today.